Right now, somewhere in your city, a 67-year-old man is waking up at 6 a.m. Not because he has to, because 40 years of habit won't let him sleep in. He brewed coffee he doesn't fully enjoy, in a kitchen of a house that's mostly paid off, in a neighborhood that used to feel like a rival, but now feels like waiting. He worked, he saved, he did everything right. And still, every single morning, he opens a banking app and watches a number, the same number, roughly, and quietly calculates how many years it has to last. That number has a name. We call it retirement savings. But what it actually is a record of every trade he made, every hour sold, every vacation skipped, every raise that went straight into an account he wasn't allowed to touch without penalty. And here's the thing nobody told him clearly back when he was 28 and signing his first 401k enrollment form. The math was always going to be harder than they said. Not impossible, but harder. And the gap between what the system promises and what it actually delivers, that gap is where most people's retirement plans quietly fall apart. This video is about that gap. Not to scare you, not to sell you anything.
But because understanding how this machine actually works, how your working years are quietly engineered to fund decades you haven't lived yet, might be the most financially important thing you ever sit down and think through. So let's start at the beginning. There was a moment in human history when retirement didn't exist. Not as a concept, not as a life stage, not as something you planned for. You worked, then you got too old or too sick to work, then your family took care of you. Then you died, usually not long after. That was the deal for most of human civilization. The average life expectancy in 1900 was around 47 years. In the United States, the wealthiest country on Earth at the time, most people didn't retire because most people didn't live long enough to need to. Then something changed. Medicine improved, sanitation improved, food security improved, and people started living longer, a lot longer. And now we had a problem that no previous society had ever really had to solve at scale. What do you do with decades of human life that fall outside the productive working window? The first person to answer that question with policy, with an actual system, was Otto von Bismarck, Germany, 1889. He created the world's first state-backed old age pension. Workers paid in during their careers, the government paid out when they got old. The retirement age he set? 70. And average life expectancy in Germany at the time? Around 45. You see the math there. It wasn't really designed for people to collect. It was designed to look generous while being statistically unlikely to cost very much. A safety net that was positioned just above where most people would actually fall. That design logic, generous looking, structurally tight, has never fully left the retirement system. We just moved the numbers around. Fast forward to America. 1935. The Great Depression has just dismantled the illusion that hard work alone protects you from financial catastrophe. Franklin Roosevelt signs the Social Security Act. Same basic premise as Bismarck. Workers contribute, government pays out. Retirement age set at 65. Average life expectancy in 1935? 61 years. Again, the math. Not an accident, not a conspiracy, just actuarial arithmetic. The system was funded by contributions from a massive working population, paying into a pool that statistically not everyone would live long enough to drain. It worked. For decades it worked beautifully. In 1950, there were 16 workers for every one Social Security recipient. 16 people paying in for every one person drawing out. That ratio made the math easy. Today, that ratio is roughly 2.7 workers per recipient, and falling. Because the same medical progress that let people live to 85, to 90, to 95, that same progress didn't increase the birth rate, didn't expand the working age population at the same pace. The architecture of the system assumed a demographic pyramid, young and wide at the base, narrow at the top. We got an hourglass, and an hourglass doesn't balance the same way. Now here's where your personal story enters the frame. You. Wherever you are, whatever age you are, if you earn a paycheck in America, you are already inside the system whether you signed up or not. Every payday,
before you see a single dollar, 6.2% of your income is taken for Social Security, another 1.45% for Medicare. If you're employed, your employer matches that, doubles it, pays the same percentage you do on your behalf without you ever seeing it move. That's nearly 15% of your labor cost going straight into the public retirement infrastructure before your personal savings even begin. Not a suggestion, not optional, not a choice. You're in, and you'll be in for as long as you work. Now, Social Security isn't nothing. For roughly 40% of Americans over 65, it provides more than half their income. For about 15%, it's nearly everything.
But here's what Social Security was never designed to be: enough. The average monthly Social Security benefit in 2024 was around $1,900. That's $22,800 a year. The MIT Living Wage Calculator estimates that a single adult in a mid-cost American city needs somewhere between $40,000 and $55,000 a year to cover basic expenses comfortably. The gap between $22,800 and $45,000 doesn't close by itself. That gap is yours to fill. And filling it, that's what the rest of the retirement system is built around. Enter the 401k. A somewhat accidental revolution. A tax attorney named Ted Benna was reading through a new tax code provision, Section 401, Paragraph K, and noticed something: a loophole. A way for employees to defer a portion of their salary into a special account, pre-tax, and let it grow without being taxed until withdrawal. It wasn't designed to be a retirement savings vehicle. It was a footnote in a tax bill aimed at executive compensation. Benna saw something else in it. He proposed the first 401k plan to his employer. His employer said no. He implemented it for his own benefits consulting clients instead. By 1983, almost half of all large U.S. companies had a 401k plan. By 1990, it had largely replaced the pension as the primary private retirement vehicle for American workers.
That shift from pension to 401k is one of the most consequential financial changes of the 20th century, and most people who lived through it barely noticed it happening. Here's the difference. A pension, a traditional defined benefit plan, works like this. You work for a company for 30 years. The company promises you a specific monthly payment for the rest of your life after retirement. They manage the money, they take the investment risk. You get the guarantee. A 401k, a defined contribution plan, works like this. You contribute a percentage of your salary. Your employer may contribute a match. The money goes into investment accounts that you mostly manage yourself. The growth depends on how markets perform. There is no guarantee. In one generation, American workers went from being passengers in the retirement vehicle to being the driver, with no training, no map, and a destination that kept moving further away. The companies loved it, because a 401k is a defined cost. A pension is a defined liability, one you can budget, one can bankrupt you if the workforce ages faster than expected. IBM did it, Kodak did it, GM tried and failed expensively. So over the 80s and 90s, pension after pension was frozen, reduced, or eliminated. And the 401k became, by default and design, the retirement system most Americans now depend on. Let's talk about what a 401k actually does, mechanically, without the brochure language. You earn money, you elect to defer, say, 10% of it. That 10% never shows up in your paycheck. It goes directly into an account. Because it's pre-taxed, your taxable income drops.
If you're in the 22% tax bracket and you put in $10,000, you effectively saved $2,200 in taxes that year. That's the first win. The government is essentially subsidizing your savings by letting you pay taxes later instead of now. Your employer, if you're lucky, matches some of it. A common structure is dollar for dollar, up to 3 to 6% of your salary. So if you earn $80,000 and contribute 6%, that's $4,800, your employer adds another $4,800. You just earned a 100% return on that contribution before a single investment grows. That match is, financially speaking, the closest thing to free money that most workers will ever encounter. And roughly a third of eligible workers don't contribute enough to get the full match. They're leaving the free money on the table. Now, the money sits in mutual funds, index funds, target date funds, depending on what you chose from a menu that most people selected in 10 minutes on their first week at a new job and never revisited. And here is where the mechanism becomes both beautiful and brutal. Compound interest. The idea that money, given time, multiplies, not just by growing, but by growing on its previous growth. If you invest $10,000 at age 25 in a broad market index fund that averages 7% annual returns, by age 65, that $10,000 becomes roughly $150,000. You put in 10. Time and math gave you 140 more. But here's the brutal part. The same math in reverse works against you if you start late. That same $10,000 invested at age 45 instead of 25, at 65, it's worth around $40,000, not $150,000, 40. The difference between starting at 25 and starting at 45 isn't the difference between one good decade and two more. It's the difference between $150,000 and $40,000 from the same initial investment. Time is not evenly distributed in the system. The people who benefit most from compound interest are the people who could afford to invest young. The people who couldn't afford to invest in their 20s, the people paying off student loans, covering childcare, sending money home to family, those people get the less generous version of the same machine. That's not a moral indictment of the system, it's just the arithmetic, but it matters. Let's build the full picture now. Let's talk about what retirement actually costs. This is where most people's assumptions hit the hardest wall. Common advice says you need 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income to maintain your lifestyle in retirement. That sounds reasonable until you stress test it. Take someone earning $100,000 a year. They want $75,000 in annual retirement income. They plan to retire at 65. They might live to 90. 25 years of retirement income needed. How much do they need saved? Financial planners commonly use something called the 4% rule. The idea is simple. If your savings are invested and you withdraw no more than 4% per year, the portfolio should theoretically last 30 years without running out. To generate $75,000 a year using the 4% rule, you need $1.875 million saved. Nearly $2 million. The median retirement savings for Americans aged 55 to 64, the people closest to retirement, is somewhere around $185,000. Not $1.875 million, $185,000. That is a gap so large it barely fits in the same conversation. And the 4% rule itself has been challenged. It was developed in 1994 based on historical stock and bond market data from a specific era. In today's environment, with longer life expectancies, lower bond yields, higher healthcare costs, and sequence of returns risk, some researchers argue the safe withdrawal rate might be closer to 3% or 3.5. At 3%, that $1.875 million becomes $2.5 million needed. The number keeps moving away from where most people are standing. Now let's talk about the thing that nobody puts in the retirement brochure: healthcare. Fidelity's annual estimate for healthcare costs in retirement for a 65-year-old couple, as of recent calculations, approximately $315,000 out of pocket over the course of retirement. That's after Medicare kicks in. Medicare doesn't cover dental, doesn't cover vision, doesn't cover most long-term care, has premiums, deductibles, copays. And long-term care, nursing homes, assisted living, in-home aid services, that's a category that can cost anywhere from $50,000 to over $100,000 per year, per person, with no ceiling. The median stay in a nursing home is around 2.5 years. But roughly 20% of people who need long-term care need it for 5 years or more. For those people, the math is catastrophic without insurance or significant pre-built savings. And long-term care insurance? The premiums have increased dramatically over the past decade as insurers realized their original pricing assumptions were wrong. Many companies exited the market entirely. So there is a very real scenario, more common than most retirement projections account for, where someone does everything right, saves diligently for 40 years, retires with a reasonable nest egg, and then spends it all in the final 4 years of their life on care they couldn't avoid and couldn't fully plan for. Not dramatic, not unusual. Just the quiet math of growing old in an expensive healthcare system. Let me step back now and show you the bigger force working on all of this. Inflation. Not crisis inflation. Not the dramatic, headline-making kind. Just the steady, relentless background kind. The 3% annual erosion that most retirement projections technically account for, but that most people emotionally underestimate.
If you retire at 65 with $2 million and average inflation runs at 3%, by the time you're 85, the purchasing power of that $2 million has been cut roughly in half. What cost $1 the day you retired costs $1.81 20 years later. And that's assuming your investment portfolio keeps up, which depends on markets, which are not guaranteed. The thing about inflation in retirement is that it compounds precisely when your ability to respond to it diminishes. At 45, if your expenses rise, you can work more, get a promotion, start a side income. At 80, those options are limited. You are largely fixed in your income, largely fixed in your portfolio, and the world around you gets quietly more expensive every single year. This is the slow mechanism, the one that doesn't make headlines because nothing dramatic happens on any given Tuesday. It just, year by year, inch by inch, reshapes the landscape you thought you were navigating. There's a layer to this that we haven't discussed yet. The system isn't just about your individual saving. It's about the generation of workers behind you. Remember the 16-to-1 ratio in 1950? The reason Social Security worked so well for so long was not primarily because of good investment returns. It was because the baby boom produced an enormous working-age population feeding into the system. For every retiree drawing out, there was a small army of workers paying in. That army is shrinking. The baby boomers, 76 million of them, are retiring at a rate of around 10,000 people per day. That number has been consistent since 2011 and continues through the late 2020s. As they exit the workforce, they shift from contributors to recipients, from the engine room to the passenger cabin. And the generations behind them, smaller in number, entering the workforce in a gig economy with more contractual work, fewer full benefits, more student debt, those generations are being asked to sustain a system that was architected for a demographic reality that no longer exists. Generation X has approximately 35% less in retirement savings than boomers did at the same age. Millennials, the largest living generation by U.S. Census count, entered the workforce into the 2008 financial crisis, watched their early career savings potential evaporate, accumulated historic levels of student debt, and then experienced a pandemic disruption in what should have been peak career building years. The compounding disadvantage is real. And it doesn't show up as a single bad event. It shows up as a collection of smaller moments. The year you couldn't contribute, the decade the market stalled, the divorce, the medical bill, the career transition, that individually seem manageable, but collectively reshape the trajectory. Here's the thing that good retirement advice rarely says out loud. The system was designed in an era of assumptions that have mostly broken. The assumption that you'd work for one or two employers your whole career, that you'd have a pension, that your spouse, if you had one, would also work and contribute, that you'd die relatively close to retirement age, that healthcare would be affordable, that housing would be accessible, that your children wouldn't need financial support into their 30s. Every one of those assumptions has been destabilized, and the system has not fundamentally reformed to match the new reality. What we got instead were incremental tweaks, catch-up contribution limits for people over 50, Roth IRA options, health savings accounts, target date funds that automatically rebalance, more financial literacy resources that study after study shows have limited impact on behavior. Good adjustments, genuine improvements, but not a structural rethinking. The architecture is still largely the one designed for a 1950s middle-class worker with a manufacturing job, a defined pension, and a life expectancy of 68. The person trying to retire in 2040 is not that person. So what does that person do? Let's be precise here, because vague advice is its own kind of dishonesty. The single most powerful variable in retirement outcomes isn't investment returns, isn't which funds you pick, isn't your employer's match percentage. It's time in market. Studies consistently show that the difference between starting retirement savings at 22 versus 32, 1 decade, can represent hundreds of thousands of dollars in final savings, sometimes more than the total amount contributed by the late starter. The mathematics do not lie. The engine runs on time. The second most powerful variable is savings rate, not how much you earn, how much you keep. There's a concept called the savings rate paradox. Two people earning the same income. One saves 5%, one saves 20%. The one saving 20% reaches retirement readiness in roughly half the time, not because they invested better, just because they compounded more.
A 1% increase in your savings rate, sustained over a full career, can add years to your financial security, sometimes decades. But the savings rate paradox has a dark corollary. Most of the people who most need to save more are the ones for whom saving more is structurally the hardest. Median household income in America is roughly $74,000. After taxes, basic housing, food, transportation, childcare for the families who need it, healthcare, the discretionary income available for retirement savings is thin, sometimes non-existent. Telling someone in that position to just increase their savings rate is not wrong advice. It's just incomplete. Let me bring this back to where we started. That 67-year-old man with his morning coffee and his banking app. He's a composite. He's millions of people. He's your father or your uncle, or a version of you in 30 or 40 years. He did what the system asked. He contributed, he diversified, he tried not to panic during downturns. But somewhere in the middle decades, the rules shifted under him, quietly, without announcement. His pension was converted to a defined contribution plan. His healthcare premiums in retirement were higher than projected. His home value, which he'd counted on as a backup, appreciated, but so did everything else. And his kids needed help longer than expected.
So the number in the app is enough. Mostly. But it requires care, attention, ongoing math, the kind of quiet management he thought he was done with when he stopped going to an office. And this is the part that's genuinely uncomfortable. Retirement was sold as the end of financial stress. What it actually is, for most people, is a different kind of financial stress. Instead of wondering if you're accumulating fast enough, you're wondering if you're drawing down slowly enough. Instead of watching a number grow, you watch it shrink, hopefully at a rate that ends when you do, not before. That shift is psychologically strange, jarring. Nobody fully prepares you for watching a lifetime of savings become an expense. And the system, the policy, the incentive structure, the cultural narrative, was never particularly interested in preparing you for it. Here's the larger truth this video has been building toward. Retirement as we know it is a 20th century invention, a specific invention designed for specific economic conditions, specific demographics, specific lifespans and healthcare costs and labor market structures. Most of those conditions no longer fully apply, and the 21st century has not yet produced a successor system. We're in the overlap, the messy middle, where the old architecture is straining and the new one doesn't yet exist. Social Security faces a funding shortfall projected to require benefit cuts or tax increases by around 2033 to 2035 without legislative reform.
Not a collapse. That language is oversimplified. But a meaningful reduction. Somewhere in the range of 20 to 25% cut in benefits if nothing changes. Traditional pensions now cover fewer than 15% of private sector workers, down from 39% in 1980. The 401k system, which replaced it, has transferred market risk to individuals, who, research consistently shows, make predictable behavioral errors. Panic selling in downturns, contributing inconsistently, drawing down early, underestimating longevity. And the platforms and advisors and financial products built to help navigate this system vary wildly in quality, alignment, and cost. Some are excellent, some are extractive. Most people lack the expertise to tell the difference. This is the world the current workforce is retiring into. Not a broken world, not a hopeless one, but an honest one. One where the gap between the story told about retirement and the actual mechanics of it requires your active attention. Not paranoia, attention. There is one more thing worth saying. The people who navigate this best, not the wealthiest, not the luckiest, but the ones who actually retire with security and relative peace, they share something in common. They understood early enough that this was their problem to solve. Not the government's, not their employers, not the markets. Theirs. They took the time, uncomfortable time, not always fun time, to understand the actual numbers in their actual situation, not the average, their situation. They made decisions with eyes open, not optimistic projections, not worst-case panic, but honest, grounded, updated annually math. They thought about the levers they actually controlled: savings rate, time horizon, expense management, tax efficiency, and they ignored, as much as possible, the levers they couldn't control: market performance, political outcomes, macroeconomic conditions. None of them were perfect. Most of them had setbacks. But the single biggest predictor of their outcome wasn't timing or returns or luck. It was attention, sustained over decades. That sounds simple. It isn't. But it's the thing. Here's where we land. Your working years are not just earning years. Every paycheck is a negotiation with the future. Every contribution, every skipped contribution, every market cycle, every unexpected cost. These are not isolated events. They are inputs into a system that will eventually define the shape of decades you haven't lived yet. That system has gaps. It has structural weaknesses baked in from an era of different assumptions. It rewards those who start early and have margin to spare, and it punishes those who can't. It was not designed with your specific life in mind, but it is the system you are inside.
And the distance between where most people end up and where they could have ended up is almost never explained by bad luck or market timing. It's explained by late starts, inattention, overconfidence, avoidance, and more than anything else, it's explained by the belief, comfortable, understandable, entirely human, that there's still plenty of time to figure this out. There is time, but it is not infinite. And the clock, the one that decides how much of that compound interest belongs to you, it does not pause while you decide to pay attention. It just keeps running.